What size tube? When it comes to intubation, picking out the size tube is not that hard because as a rule, if you're a girl, you get a 7.5. If you're a guy, you get an 8. However, that doesn't work so well for kids. So therefore, a couple ways to figure out what size tube. The first of which, most importantly, do not memorize numbers. Because why would you possibly do that? Because remember in PALS, PEP, ENPC, they teach those fancy formulas like 16 plus the age divided by 4 divided by the social security number. Why would you possibly do that when there's got to be a better way? If you look at the PD wheel, it tells you what size tube. If you look at the Broslow tape, it tells you what size tube. If you look at Hantebi, either the book or the app, it tells you what size tube. So now we have not one, not two, but 3 independent sources, all of which say this little baby should get a 3 if we use cuffed, or a 3.5 if we use uncuffed. Great. Now you're staring at your crash cart, you've got tubes aplenty when you rip open the drawer. Well, how do you actually figure out, which one is which? It sounds absolutely basic, but interestingly, there's a couple different ways to figure this out. First of which is you just look, to no surprise, at the package. On the big people's side, depending again on the manufacturer, if you look at the package, it'll tell you in this case, it'll say ID 8.0. But then if you notice underneath, it says OD 10.7. That's important because under stress, you're like, I've got 2 different sets of numbers. Which one is it? Remember, ID is the only one you care about because that stands for inner diameter. And inner diameter is important because that's the size of the tube. Because you want air to go in and out. The problem is if somebody has already ripped open the package and they just hand you the tube. Well, now how do you figure out what size tube they just handed you? Is a couple different ways. If you look at the end, right up here towards where you hook up your ambu bag, you'll see that it says 8.0. That works really well because this, remember, is going to be sticking out of the mouth. So once the tube is in, if you want to figure out what size tube, that's a good place to look. If you haven't yet placed it into the airway, then if you look down at the other end of the tube, it'll say 8.0. Interestingly, there's even one more way to figure out what size tube, and that's called, if you look up here on the 15mm adapter, where you hook up your ambu bag or your ventilator to. If you notice on the tubes, they all have these little flanges that come out to the side. On the flange on the bottom, it actually shows you, it'll say 8.0. Now, I talked to a respiratory therapist about this. He said 2 things that he's done in his extensive career. Number 1 is if they're not sure what size is in there and they're unable to make out the size of the tube here. He said number 1, he's actually taken his cell phone and taken a picture from down below and then went whoop and blew it up to figure out what size tube it was. Number 2, I never ever would have thought of this. He said in the pediatric ICU setting when they had a kid who was brought in from another hospital and they couldn't figure out exactly what size it was, they actually took some Play-Doh, put it on the bottom, pulled it off, and it made a perfect imprint saying it was a 3.0. If you're just putting in the tube, read the package. If somebody hands you the tube, by the cuff, by the top, it says the size of the tube. And if all else fails, a cell phone or a little bit of Play-Doh in a pinch goes a long way.